start this and that. Ready, 3, 2, 1, go. And we're live. Let me see. Yes, numbers going up, so that's good. So welcome everybody to today's session. Welcome, Andrew. Thank you for doing this, man. Appreciate it.
Hey.
We'll wait maybe just a couple of minutes, let people trickle in. Numbers going up nicely. So this is it's the second US webinar that we're doing, so it's still a bit of a test. Hopefully the time zone is a little bit friendlier for US based folks. And in fact, it was only published on our US group. So let us know if the time is good. Also feel free to just drop in the chat where you guys are joining from. Just the usual kind of housekeeping rules. So the session is recorded, so don't go crazy on note taking or anything like that. We'll send it over per email tomorrow morning, and the session will be about 45 minutes, although we always have time to roll over, which often happens. I think Andrew will cover some slides for about 20-30 minutes, and then we can open up to Q&A. However, if you guys have any questions as we go through things, feel free to either drop them in the chat, or actually, if you want to use the Q&A, that's better because they get organized. That's nice. There you go, Mateus from São Paulo. Hello. Some US-based folks. But yes, also, it's the Americas, right? So it all works. Awesome. I think we can get started. I do want to do a bit of a tiny PlatformCon plug as per usual. For those of you who don't know, we're hosting the first PlatformCon, which is specifically virtual free conference about platform engineering. Andrew is gonna talk at it as well, and in fact, let me drop here in the chat to everyone. There's the link to Andrew's talk there. And so I think we can also use today's session maybe to just see if, maybe also discuss that and get some feedback and ahead of that. Hey, Laszlo, I think we can get started. So numbers looking good. Andrew, show is yours. I'll shut up and disappear.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Can you guys all see this? Thumbs up or say in the chat. Yes. Cool. Let's see, Keynote always makes me weird. It's a lot more windows in this Zoom meeting than normal, actually, with the chat and Q&A. Cool. So today's talk about technical decision making. I'm going to put this through the lens of Terraform, Pulumi, and SDKs for cloud. We're not going to go super deep into the technology at all, and I'll cover that in the next slide in a second here. But so quick agenda. Hopefully this runs 20 to 25 minutes. I'll give you a quick bio of myself. We can talk about why technical decisions aren't really about technology. Is the premise around a bunch of this talk. So who am I? I currently am a founder and CEO of a venture-backed startup called Pradvana. We are in the application management space, tangentially near the sort of internal development platforms that Luca and talks about a lot about. And I've been in platforms and infrastructure for the majority of my career. The last year I spent at a startup called Vise, which is in the fintech space. They're building software for RIAs. Previously to that, I spent about 8.5-9 years at Dropbox. I joined infrastructure there when it was fairly small, about 9 people, about 120 people in the company, and watched it grow to about 3,000 people. Led everything in infrastructure and the data teams there, which is about half of engineering, a little less than half of engineering. And then prior to that, I was at YouTube during hypergrowth to 2008 through 2012. And then at AOL was where I started my career. I worked on some fun products like Winamp and Shoutcast, if people remember those, and a bunch of streaming media stuff. So a lot of infrastructure and platform experience. So let's go through a quick story. So when we started Pradvana, my co-founder and our first engineer got in a room, and I mean, there's three of us, but let's pretend this is the one. They're in their one-on-one, they're talking, and they're saying, okay, Napat says to Mike, we got to figure out what we're going to do here. We're building something in the platform space. We're going to need to deal with infrastructure as code. There's no way around it. I need you to go figure out what to do. Let's figure this problem out. And Mike says, Napat, that sounds great. That's why I signed up. It's been awesome to have this one-on-one. I've taken a lot of notes here. You want me to go figure out how we're going to interface this infrastructure as code layer with this thing we're going to build on top of it. We need to understand what our customers want. We need to understand a bunch of things. Let me go figure it out. So Mike does what I typically do too, which is he goes on a run or goes and exercises, and he's like loads it in the back of his mind. And he's sitting there thinking, okay, what am I going to do? We've got nothing. We've got written 0 lines of code. We need to figure out how we're going to pick the right sort of interface with the right infrastructure as code layer. What are we going to use? So Mike's out. Mike's like, I got it. I figured it out. Light bulb goes off. Mike says, I'm going to propose something. And he says this puzzle piece fits perfectly into this framework we're going to build that Mike's put together in his head while he's off on his run. And he gets on his scooter. He zips over to the office. We're actually all virtual, and he ends up in a room like this, right? You know, it's only 3 of us, but I imagine most of you, and I wish I could see your faces, have sat in these architecture or design reviews where it's endless litigation. Like, just let's do like show of hands in the chat if anybody's ever been in one of these meetings where you just get peppered with questions that are completely random, and you're kind of like, but I thought through all of this, and this is the thing we should do, and I know what the solution is. Any takers on this one? If you want to just say in the chat if this resonates with you. So Mike's trying to he's like, what? It's only 3 of us. Why are you asking me so many questions? He goes back to his desk, right? I'm guessing David probably has had this experience. You go back to your desk and you're like, oh man, that sucked. Like, I really did not enjoy that. And I actually don't understand what I was supposed to do then, because that one-on-one said like, come with a proposal. And it's like, this is what we're going to solve. But I was just like peppered with questions that are completely inane and don't have anything to do with the subject matter that we're trying to solve for. And that point, the question is like, can this be different? I hope it can be different. And I think it can be different. And so that story is not actually what played out. And we actually went through this process very, very differently. But in that hypothetical story, I have definitely seen that in orgs that I've run and been part of in the past, where you kind of you have this like very, it doesn't really matter which direction you pick sort of technical decision, but it becomes, the religious war, the holy war type of Emacs versus VI debate in an architecture review, and nothing comes out of it. So I think this can be different. And so let's run through a way we could think about this in a different way. So at Pradvana, we actually think about this very, very differently than I've experienced in a lot of places. We are incredibly values driven, and we think about this with a pretty clear framework, and we apply this framework to literally everything we do, whether it's deciding how we're going to pick software or how we're going to make a hire, or what process we're going to introduce. And so we think of this as our beliefs, our purpose, and our values. And I know this sounds fluffy in a lot of ways, and a lot of people think, oh, we have a mission statement, we have these things, but the way we operationalize this becomes very different when it comes down to technical decision making. And so we think of this as like our clear North Star. What's our belief? What do we believe as a group universally? What's the purpose? Like, why do we exist, and why do we exist, and why are we doing it here? And then how do we? What are the values? How do we operate? So our belief is we believe in 0 overhead. So this has to play into our technical decision making then. When we think of anything we do, we have to think of what technical solution is going to produce the least amount of overhead for us, because that's the problem we're trying to solve. We believe in 0 overhead. We don't want that for ourselves. We don't want that for our customers. We don't believe anything we should do in the world should have overhead that's not necessary. And so our belief is we need to drive to that every single time. And so then we say, okay, we exist. We want to build an application management platform that transcends the cloud's complexity. So we want to manage applications. We want to give developers experiences that basically they don't need to think about the public cloud. They don't need to think about the cloud at all. They just think about code. They think about producing value for their customers, and they're not in this, oh, I need to understand all this technical jargon to make my thing work. Like that's not what they're getting. They're, developers are there to produce value for the consumer of the product, not to be slaves to the infrastructure that's there. So we think of it as like, how do we get them a transcendent platform in that sense? And then we do it by being trustworthy, intentional, and empathetic, right? And so we think of these are our sort of guiding North Stars around everything we do. Questions so far? I'll pause here. Any questions, like just throw them in chat. I'll give like a 20-second sort of pause here, because I think it's important to think about this from a lens of there's a lot of ways to think about technology, and we tend to think of it as people first, and we want to start with this framing before we dive into the technical. So any questions on this? This framework makes sense so far? It's always hard on Zoom calls. So we have this framework. We have Mike, who in some worlds would have gone on his run and been super frustrated. And here we're trying to get him to a place where he's not super frustrated. We're trying to take this developer and this engineer that's super highly motivated to solve this problem and is world-class in technology. But there's this, there's three of us, there's many of us, there's like in all situations, there's multiple people involved. And so the real question is, how do we get us all on the same page around this technical decision? How do we actually think about these pieces of technology? So this is our stack, right? We have a management platform that sits on top of infrastructure as code, and there's a cloud foundation. I'm guessing most stacks are fairly similar. You can swap on a management platform with application in any other company as well. And this stack is roughly what's there. There's some application with an infrastructure as code abstraction that then goes into a cloud foundation, like whether it's at Amazon or Google, doesn't really matter, but this is what you're managing effectively. So this is the part, to recap, this is where we want Mike to dive into. This is what we want Mike to figure out what the issues are with. We need him to go and do the deep dive to convince us that one of these various platforms in Terraform, Pulumi, or the SDKs from the cloud provider is the right one for us to build on top of. So that's what he's trying to figure out. And there's so many options, right? We kind of covered them. There's Pulumi, there's Terraform, there's SDKs. All of these are valid options for many organizations, actually all organizations in a lot of ways. There's nothing that's going to say, on the surface, they all really accomplish the same job, and they really all accomplish the same job in a reasonable way. And so then it becomes, why are you going to pick one of these over the rest of them? And in Mike's case, Mike's looking around, he's like, I really don't know which one to pick. I'm just kind of, we've got nothing, right? We've got no code written. We know what the stack is going to look like, but we really don't know what's around the corners. And so we could have spent many, many, many hours in that room debating all of the merits of Pulumi and all the merits of Terraform and all the merits of like selecting the SDKs and building on top of them. And we probably would have spent weeks, if not months, on top of this, right? You could clearly start companies on top of this. You look at Pulumi and Hashi, they've done that, right? They've said, okay, we're going to go super deep in this problem. We're going to try to solve it in some specific way. But that wasn't the goal that we were trying to accomplish, right? So we said, let's go back. Let's look back, North Star. What's the thing we're trying to accomplish here? What we're trying to accomplish is build an application management platform at the end of the day. So we need to pick one of these and move on. But how do we do that? It still becomes the question. So then the next way we thought about it is like, what's the problem we're solving? What's the thing that we're actually trying to get done here? What's the job that this infrastructure as code layer is going to do for us? And what are the characteristics we need, right? This is like very simple sort of requirements gathering, but it's requirements gathering in a different type, right? Because we really don't have anything out there yet. We haven't actually shipped anything. We're actually trying to decide on what the stack is. And I'm sure a lot of us are doing this as the world changes. You're always looking at things and saying like, okay, what am I gonna put into the system next? And that's a challenge, right? And so we said the problem is we want a repeatable interface between us and the cloud. So still not more narrowed down, but at least we understand that that's what the layer is going to do. So we said, okay, Mike, like let's take that. What's the next thing? And then we went back to the North Star, right? And so we had these values. We just sort of broke it apart and we said, okay, let's be super principled about this. Well, whatever we pick has to be trustworthy. So like, we're gonna have to dive into that. We're gonna have to define trustworthy for us. It has to be intentional. Like, it's one of our values. So whatever system we pick has to have intentionality built into it. It has to be transcendent for the cloud, can't introduce overhead, has to be empathetic back to the user, both us and the customer on top of it. And we looked at this as our framework for technical decision making, as opposed to starting from the other direction, which I'd argue is like, let's build a matrix of all the features it has and then try to pick from that. We said, let's start from the 10,000 foot view and start to go downwards, because we know that nothing is going to be perfect, but we want to actually make sure that it fits in with who we are as a team and who we are as people that are going to have to operate this. Because it's like, if you, trying to think of an analogy here. I think of technology as, it's very much like if you're a race car driver and someone's giving you a car that you've never driven before, it's not going to feel the same as the one you're normally racing in. And so we want the technology and the stack to actually feel that way, because we want no overhead there, right? This goes back to the no overhead principle we have. And so we want to look at this and say like, okay, this thing is going to be the right fit for us and fit us just right. We're not looking for the solution that like may have all the bells and whistles. We want it to be just right for us. So it becomes kind of self-evident, and we're going to cover these three: trustworthy, intentional, and transcendent, and kind of dive into, across those platforms, like, how do we think about them? So the first is trustworthy. We said, okay, it's got to be trustworthy. And when we thought about trust, we broke that down again into like its constituent parts. You can probably sense a theme here in how we think about development. We try to like break things apart down to the smallest pieces and then sort of put them back together again. And so for us, trust is being reliable, meaning that what you say you're going to do, it does. Competent, you're capable of doing the job and you don't have a lot of bugs, and it's motivated correctly. And in this case, when we think of software motivations, it's aligned towards the customer that either us or the person we're selling to. And it feels like it's moving in that direction with us. So for us, we want to test, it had to be testable. We are in the business of writing a SaaS platform that is deployed to people's production environments, that they put the keys of their kingdom on. We can't have something that's flaky. We can't have something that testing isn't its first-class citizen. We can't have something where we are going to look at it and say, it's so far in the loop of development loop that we don't know until integration. We need to actually bring it closer to us. It needs to be repeatable. It has to work correctly in our development environments. It has to work correctly in our production environments. And then most importantly, it has to be aligned towards the customer that we have. And our customer, and the way we think about it, is we're building an application platform. So the customer is the application engineer. This is somebody that's deeply steeped in code, not in cloud. And so we think about it as, okay, when we look at these solutions, they have to fit that, right? So the SDKs probably fit that. Pulumi fits that to some degree. We look at it as, okay, it has to be alignment on that side. It can't expose and be a net new thing that they have to learn on top of everything else that's happening, because it needs to be motivated. Like, the motivation has to be geared towards them. Then it comes down to intentionality. How does the system perform? And this is when you think of software, how does any software system perform? And so when we looked at these three pieces of software, we said, is it clear? Is it systematic, and is it strongly typed? Again, strongly typed kind of goes back to this theme of being sort of trustworthy for us, or can it be strongly typed? And so we started teasing them apart, right? Like, really, Pulumi for us met this in the best possible way. We started to dig into the clarity of Terraform, and when we talked to a ton of customers, what we found is like that was a big challenge for the application teams, is it wasn't clear to them. It wasn't a system that they could understand, right? It's very clear and understandable by the infrastructure teams potentially that we're using it, but it wasn't for the interface, for the team that we were trying to solve for. So we need to be empathetic for the user. We need to look at it through that lens. And so we started to like dig through this, like, okay, what's the right solution on the intentionality side? And then Transcendent, does it like fight the cloud? Does it, or like the like Uber cloud concept, right? So if we look at the SDKs, we had aspirations of making sure that we could support things outside of sort of the big three, whether it's using backends on Cloudflare workers or things like that, like Lambdas in different places. We needed something that didn't sort of fight against us and have us have to write a ton of scaffolding on top of it. And then we had to be able to build upon that. Like, we had to support multiple interfaces. And this goes to the, like, what type of product we were going to build. It had to be transcendent for us. And so this is the framing we use when we think about the technical decision making. And everyone's probably familiar with this, right? It's like the Goldilocks and Three Bears. We looked at it as, okay, let's take this piece of software, like all these various pieces of software that are out there. We're trying to find. I have 3 more of these plants. These are presents from my wife. We were trying to find a piece of software that fit sort of this like right size for us. And that's what we use a North Star for. We're not using it to pick the best piece of software in the world. We're trying to fit the best piece of software for the problem that we have, for the people that we are, and for where we're going. And so when we looked at this, like, the clear answer for us was, it was a pretty easy choice at this point for us. Pulumi met our requirements. I'm not going to sit here and say this will meet your requirements. And I'd actually advocate that you use a similar framework, right? Like, sit down with your engineering teams and understand exactly what they care about. What are the principles that they have when it comes to decision making? What are the decisions, the principles you want to apply to it? Because for us, this became very key. And I can't even count the number of times where my co-founder said, okay, we definitely made the right selection for us. Because when he had to dive into it, and he's never used Terraform, never used Pulumi, but when he looked at the ergonomics, he felt like for him, it just felt much easier to jump in with Pulumi than it did Terraform, because we've had to work with some clients that do some Terraform. So this is the framework that we use. And so the question I'd prompt to this room, I think I faster presentation I wanted, because I've only practiced this once or twice, but I would ask sort of this room, like, and I'd love to have a discussion, like, how do we make technical decisions? How do people think about taking technical decisions today? Do you apply this type of lens when you're trying to select a new piece of technology to bring into your stack? Did what I say resonate with you on sort of like pulling up the altitude a little bit, so you're not in that room, in that litigation room where you're defending the micro? You're actually given the agency to make it based on a set of values and principles that sort of should be encouraged to the organization. So I'm going to pause here. I want to open sort of the floor and kind of, I don't know, Luca, does this work from does it turn into a group chat, or we just do everything through Q&A and chat? But I would love to take questions and hear what people have to say.
Yeah, no, well, and thanks for that. No, this works. I think we still need to go through the Q&A and chat. If anyone wants to, be brave enough to step up, we can also make you, I think I can make you somehow, sort of like presenter, and then we can just have a conversation. But otherwise, feel free to just use the chat and the Q&A to share your thoughts.
And I'm also, I can go deeper onto what we did to test a bunch of this stuff, but I find that significantly less interesting when it comes to this type, my hope here is to help teams give a framework to how they can make decisions like this in the future for themselves, versus take away and say oh no, Pulumi is the right thing. Because I tell you this, in another mode, it's totally the wrong solution. And so I look at it as I really want to encourage engineering to think of it from a principled perspective, for what fits for them.
Yeah, 100%. David says it makes sense to him. Yeah, if you guys want to sort of have a more open conversation to everybody, make sure that you send to everyone, because otherwise just we as the panelists see the message.
Yeah. David, can you say more? You said this is a different perspective. What's the perspective you normally see? And what's the perspective most people see here?
So, Laszlo, I come from a big company. If I want to buy a license and try to use it everywhere. Yeah, we've seen that. It's interesting. We're having this conversation with the backstage folks, for instance, and how it's interesting. In a lot of cases, they see sort of like this like kind of like top down approach to the rollout of backstage, where like somebody high up decides that like, hey, we need to use this, and then somehow people in the teams then need to go and figure out, right, like what do we actually need to, what do we use this for, right? Which yeah, it's an interesting dynamic that you see in larger companies. I guess you probably saw that as well, Andrew, in the the bigger companies days, at least after the growth, or not?
No, almost the opposite. We tended to think of it as, and actually this is the way I actually can, it was the best possible mindset I think we had very early on inside of infrastructure at Dropbox, was that it's not, too many people in platforms and infrastructure think of it as a monopoly. And we became, tried to find be very intentionally say this is not a monopoly. You need to defend this against, if this is a free market, the best product would win. And so when we were doing storage, for example, we had we built our own storage stack for cost reasons. But what we would do is we continuously benchmarked it against S3, because we were saying that we always, and we said from the only thing we said top down is that you will maintain a lever to migrate back to S3. We moved like almost an exabyte of storage off. We will maintain that lever to put it back. And the reason we wanted there as a leadership team is that we wanted that to be there to force the conversation on quality and cost and reliability. Like we needed to have a stick for the team too, right? It's like, okay, you've done this great thing, it's amazing, you've saved a ton of money, but you still need to actually make improvements to this. And so we did that. And so there was like, that lever was there. And then when we thought about technology, the technology that we're building ourselves, like internally, we had this notion of like, we called drop cloud at the time, but it was much more, it was very like, it's probably 7-8 years ago. It was like a very platform oriented notion where there was a customer and we would not, my VP at the time basically would say, look, if there's a better product and the product team wants to use it, they can. Like, that means that we failed because our job is to provide them that solution. And so we didn't find them that solution. So if we didn't find them that solution, we failed. Because that should have been in our toolkit. So that's our failure. And if we built them something, meaning we went off and said that we need to build versus buy, and it doesn't meet their needs and they want to use something else, then we failed. So the only person you can point at is yourself. If like that, if you like, your job is to create the monopoly by winning the market, right? And like, it needs to work like any other product in the wild. And I think too often infrastructure and product teams don't see it that way. They see it as like, I just could use the proverbial band hammer and say like, there is a top-down approach to it. And I think that actually it stifles innovation and it forces like, it forces the empathy to move away from the customer and just becomes like, it's a different optimization function. And so I personally don't like, I haven't seen it. And I think it's not a great, I don't know. I don't think it produces the best technical results, to be honest, if you just sort of top down it.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. It definitely doesn't bring the best. It's just unfortunately something that we see a lot, especially large enterprise, right? And obviously you work for some of the, best engineering organizations, but unfortunately that's not the average. But I think, Laszlo, that's also what you kind of were referring to, right? The we build it versus we buy it, right? That I think is interesting. And Andrew, like, I'm just curious, because obviously you've done platforms for such a long time, and you and I spoke about this before, where the platform engineering community, these meetups, the platform con and everything, just very recently, is bubbling up. But you've been looking for this for a long time, right? And you've been building this for a long time, but there was not really a definition around it, a community around it, and so hopefully now this community can make things easier for like newcomers. But from your perspective, like having seen this whole evolution, I guess like what's next from your, in your view? right? And maybe you can also talk a little bit about like how you and Pravana look at it, but you know, like I think we're still very much in the let's define what this is phase. But then, you know, what do you see after this?
I think that I go back to the story we were just talking about. I think that the level of empathy is going up, I hope, as my hope of what I'm hoping to see, is that there is the siloed nature. I mean, I joined the industry in the early 2000s, and like there was definitely a siloed nature, right? Like you had your operations team, you had your software engineering team, you threw it over the wall, and that's how things operated. I mean, at AOL, we had a knock. Like it was like I saw those days, right? It's like everybody is sitting there watching the graph to see if the graph goes down before, you know, and that's like how pushes were actually done, right? So it's like push a software, like the pipeline's not telling you what's happening. There's some person in this room with 1,000 monitors. Its job is to look at this thing, right? So like we've come a long way from that, right? And I think that was really easy to be empathetic to that person, right? You're just like, that job is just awful, right? And like so many tools were like, let's make it a little better for that person, or like let's remove that, right? Let's make efficiency there, right? But I think that that's been lost the higher up we've gone in the stack. And I saw this like even 5 years ago, like we were building data centers, and like the place that was really easy to be empathetic was our data center team. I once watched they were bringing up racks, and what we saw was they had to go a quarter mile from the room back from the data center floor back to their office to like push a button on the laptop, because we didn't have Wi-Fi on the data center floor, right, for security reasons. So like it's really obvious, right? When you watch that workflow is awful, right? Like it's like, okay, I'm leaving point A, I'm walking a quarter mile to push a button to turn a rack up and then come back and finish like what I was doing. And so like you observe that, and it's very clear. I would love to know, like I open the forum here, in the 24 people here that I assume most of us work in platforms. How many of you watched a user in the last week perform their job end to end? Like show of hands that somebody's done that. I don't know how the hands thing works in this thing, but or like emoticon or something, right? Like, has anybody, like, let me start there. Has anybody watched, like sat down, sat next to somebody and watched their entire daily workflow for what they're using? Like, to me, that like, then it's like, how do you know it's working for them?
For 7 years.
I'd say it's easy to do remotely. It's like significantly easier to do remotely. Fire up a Zoom. Ask them to record. Right? Like when I do developer tools for Dropbox, I actually was like helping fix this problem. We used to go to Seattle all the time and just like sit there and watch them do development. And like, cause like, I didn't understand why they kept telling us, like, look, this is a team, by the way, with Guido Van Rossum on it, like fixing the developer tools for Python, right? So like we have Guido working on developer tools for Python, and like, we're trying to figure out like what's going on here. And they're telling us they want VS Code. We could not figure out for the life of us what was going on. And we ended up having to go there and sit there and watch. And we ended up seeing is like, oh shit, we need a plugin that makes Bazel accessible from VS Code, because they're not going to jump from VS Code to the terminal back. And like just that fix like was so instrumental in like generating, like it was just like night and day. I think that like to me, like every single person in platform needs to start doing that. They need to, like, I used to ask the engineering teams inside of their own CD systems, they had to be part of the on-call rotations of application teams for deployments, because otherwise they just never tested the system. And so like when we're building Pradvana right now, one of the concepts we have is actually it's Pradvana on Pradvana. The entire development workflow has to be done on the system itself. Otherwise, like we're like, this is like, we have to dog food it. And then what we want is like, we want to watch every single user click every single button and like understand like where every bit of overhead is for them in the system. Because that's the, like to us, like that's where the empathy comes from. And it's like, given the number of no's here, like my call to action would be like, everyone try it. Just like find one person and just like watch what they're doing. Even if you learn nothing, you'll at least learn something, which is that like your flow works, right? Like you, like that is still something, right? And I think the act of just hearing and seeing that also goes a long way. Because that person, I guarantee you, will tell you 3 to 5 other people that, oh, this person from the platform team like came and like talked to me and wanted to understand what's happening. And they'll tell 5 other people, right? And that generates so much goodwill that like when you do break something or something does go wrong, like you can play it forward, right? Think of it in both ways. It's well worth the time. How do you get to do orgs to embrace that? Can you say more? Are you trying to get the org to give the feedback, or are you trying to get the tooling to get modified when there is feedback? Oh, so it's this goes, okay. I think that if the org is not giving feedback, it's my hypothesis, I don't know the org at all, but like there's 2 problems, right? Like normally when I saw this post on LinkedIn yesterday, actually, it's like when teams are giving lots of feedback, that's great. Like even if they're just mad, right? That's great. If they're not giving feedback, like dig into why. My hypothesis is that they don't feel that they don't feel heard, and they've been so marginalized in the past that they're at a point now where they're no longer willing to give the feedback. And that's a very long journey back. That becomes like, I would say almost every single day, like if you have belief, purpose, values, whatever you have, whatever framework you're using, right, for like how you're prioritizing work or how you're getting feedback, is send it constantly every week. Here's my developer experience update. This is what I've seen. This is what we need. Like you have to engage and you have to get that dialogue to come back. And there's no other way besides elbow grease in that case. The minute it's like the same in any community, right? Once the voice gets shut down, it's like you have to like it's like any it's a marginalized community effectively is what you're describing, right? And so I just go to all the literature around how to engage in that type of conversation. And that there's no other way to do it. And it's the unfortunate, like, because it's not an easy problem with that if there's not giving feedback. I will gladly take an org that's just very upset all the time over one that's like not saying anything. I wish I had a better answer for you, but I think it's like it's so situationally specific if they've already shut down.
Yeah, and I think, Andrew, it's a super interesting topic that we see come up a lot is how do you build that, effective feedback loop between the, platform team basically and the rest of the engineer organization. And it feels to me, I don't know about folks here, I'd love to, if you want to drop in the chat, how you got into building a platform. But what we see a lot of times is, just effectively an infrastructure SRE team that suddenly becomes a platform team. And it becomes, it's just because, now we're building a platform. But the thing is that there needs to be a really deep mindset shift, right? From, you're maintaining a system and your infrastructure and you're optimizing for reliability and uptime and whatever to, hey, we're actually building a product and our customers are the rest of the engineering organization. And it's extremely hard to do that shift, right? And so how do you do that? And how do you build that feedback loop?
I mean, I can, it was very hard for me personally. Like I started in reliability engineering. And what I found, this is my personal journey and I don't know how applicable it will be to people, but 2 things. One is stay at organizations long enough to see the pain and see the problems and pick and like optimize for experiences as opposed to promotions, if that makes sense. I have managed every team in infrastructure. I had managed every team in infrastructure at Dropbox before I actually was like a VP. Like this is director, senior director, but like I jumped around from everything from developer tools to all production side to like building out the initial SRE team to running the storage teams, the monitoring teams, like, and every one of those, right? It's like a different problem and a different, like, it's like what, at least in the United States, like in the 60s, 70s, right? Like, you travel the plants right? Like that mentality, like you go to, if you're at GE, right, you go to middle of nowhere to learn whatever is happening at that place, and you come and I felt like I got that experience, and I think it's not, my take is it's not valued enough anymore. And if you optimize, like I was just optimizing if you're just like learning of these things. And then and then it became like, you have this intersection of business, technology, and user. And so for me, technology was like on the serving path, like earning like scale and doing all of that. Like I did that for the most beginning part of my career. The user was like development tools, right? You just like focus on the user, focus on the user, focus on the user. And like business side was like, okay, as a VP, how do I intersect these? And then like, how do I deal with sort of like supply chain and the rest of that? And like the fact of building data centers, like a different, like it's like real estate, like that's a different problem. And then like it's putting the intersection of them together, but there's no shortcut because I think all of them require experience. They all require you to like actually go do the work. So for me, it was like every year I'd pick a focus. I was like, okay, let me focus on the user this year. I'm just going to learn how the users think. And that's the only thing I'm going to do right now. And it's, I don't know, that's at least how I thought about it. And then like that let me make the mindset shift, right? Like, because it was like, I'm putting myself in a situation where I have to make that shift. And I wanted to have the experiences across all of these things. I do think that, by the way, something you said that I think is exceedingly dangerous coming from the reliability side of the world is when reliability teams get put in platform roles. I think it's dangerous on both perspectives. I was talking to a good friend this morning who's an SRE manager, and this just happened to him literally at like close to a decacorn. He just like got put into like joined as SRE manager 3 weeks ago. He's now running a platform team, and then asked the SRE team to be. It was exactly what you just described, Luca. And I was telling him, I was like, why did they do that? Like, and he was like, well, they want velocity. And I was like, but they thought they had a reliability problem last week, and this week they think they have a velocity problem. Like, are they going to ask you if it's a reliability problem next week? Like, it's going to, like, you have to get them to see which problem is the more important of the two and actually prioritize correctly, because you can't do both. And I think that's like, I see that trap happen a lot as well. I think that's very dangerous. And I think it's super incumbent on the reliability and the platform teams to be able to explain the business problem much more crisply to senior leaders, because otherwise you'll just move between velocity and reliability every other week. And like, then nothing, like, then I think that's where a lot of the times these communities get like a bad rap, is like, well, what are you actually doing? Well, it's like, if you didn't ask us to keep changing priorities every week, like it'd be a lot better. I don't know. I'm soapboxing a little bit here, but hopefully this resonates for some people. I like the retros and team health, by the way. I do think that's actually super important, is like sitting in on the team retros. And I would push for like ask leaders to do it. Like, to me, that's like very important. Like if leaders don't do that, that's a red flag for me on the teams or on like the company that I'm in.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And on the SRE front, you were telling me the area, because I thought that was really interesting, like how obviously, SRE as a kind of like, cultural sort of like trend in the industry comes from, Google originally. But how it's interesting how different the setup is culturally and from a, also budgeting perspective at Google. That allows SRE to be successful. Can you speak to that? I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, just for context here, like I spent a lot of time in the SRE community, like probably 7 years ago, 8 years ago, like starting like one of the original people around behind SRECon, if people have seen SRECon, and like did a bunch of work on that. So for those that don't know, the way Google works internally is there's shared headcount, which creates a natural back pressure. So SRE is like funded from the product budget, not actually from the technical operations budget, right? So the PM is actually involved in the, like, do they want to invest in this? And so that allows them to say, at a certain, and they have like water lines where like, if it goes above or below this, like SREs are just not going to be applied to it until the technical teams get the debt back down. So they have like these things that work at scale, where I think in smaller organizations, and like what I learned at Dropbox, like especially in hypergrowth, it's impossible to do it. Unresource constrained economy does not work, right? Because everyone will say just hire one more person. And so then it comes down to culture so much more. And like, then it becomes to like, okay, is the leadership team actually like pushing down the values that need to be there for people to make the right decisions day to day? But Google has like and then also Larry was always like, you can walk away from it if like the debt gets too much. Like there's like those things were there, and like they were leading from the top on that. It's not, I don't think it's, I'm actually looking at the SRE books on my bookshelf right now, and I don't think that it's captured in the Google text. And if anyone's read it, like I don't think any of that is in there. It was one of my criticisms of the book when they first launched it, was that they didn't make that clear. So if you try to apply that book like in practice, it doesn't really work. Like you can do everything, but it won't work because they like the shared headcount is like what creates back pressure in the incentive structures. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm articulating.
Keeping the juicy secrets.
My guess is they don't even realize it. Like, it's not like one of these things that they're like, oh, it's a technical book. So like, let's not even like, but that incentive is so important, right? It's like, if you can walk away from it, I'm guessing people here, if they've ever done like the reliability side, walking away from it is like, it gives you a backpressure mechanism that forces the SWE team to actually fix the problems, right? It's like you build it, you run it at Amazon. That's kind of like the Google ethos too. They just believe that, I do as well, by the way, that reliability is a discipline in and of itself, and like the only metric they should be optimizing for is reliability, and like velocity is not something they should care about in that sense. That needs to be taken care of in other ways, especially if you're running a multi-billion-dollar business. I think it's different if you're not, but in Google's case, that they understand and can quantify a nine's value in dollars, and so okay, like it's a trade-off. But I think for most people, it's probably not the right mental model.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that we are coming up on time. So if anyone has any sort of like final thoughts or last questions that you guys want to ask, feel free to do it now. Otherwise, maybe just like one last thing for me, Andrew. I mean, again, you know, you've been in this for so long, and you know, we're now building this community around it, around platform engineering. What do you think we're missing, or what else would you like to see from your perspective, or what else should we bring in?
What else would I like to see? I mean, I'm interested to see how it evolves. I think that I'm a very big believer of principles over Lucas talked to me enough now. I'm probably seen enough my presentations. I'm a big believer of principles over dogma, and that's the thing. That's the one thing I'd really encourage the community to like think hard about. I think that there was so much. I was actually at a dinner the other night with what is his name? The creator chef. I can't remember his name, and I was giving him a hard time about infrastructure as code because he was like, "Oh, it's finally there," right? And I was like, "Yeah, you created this monster, right? That like now everything has to be infrastructure as code, even when it's not the right solution." And I think that balance is needed in a lot of places, and I think platform, by definition, is a balancing act, and is like what makes it hard is it is literally the act of balancing between these two worlds, and it sits on the org boundary of in so many ways. And so that ability to balance the viewpoints needs to be there, and but at the same time have a high degree of contrast. Otherwise, like it's hard to make the trade-offs. And so a community evolves that way would be amazing, and I think that it really starts in a lot of ways with like strong leadership in that sense, like from every single person in the community, as opposed to like saying, I'm just going to cargo cult this thing, but looking at it from like, okay, if we want to be balanced, we want to take these things in, how do we do that? Because I think it's very dangerous to, in the platform world, to just like cargo cult it. It's too, pain is the best teacher. Yes, so I went to the host and panelists, but yes, pain is a good. I think balance is so important, and if you don't see the balance, if you can't get the balance right, platform can be disastrous. Like I've seen it go disastrous in places. I've built ones that don't work, and if you don't get it right, it's the worst. That's the thing. I think it's like the balance is very important, and thinking about it and not being dogmatic about solutions. I think there's way too much dogmatic, like it has to be this way because that's the way it's supposed to be. But if all these systems, people are involved, and like if you don't in their part of the system. And if you don't bring them in as part of it, like it won't work. Back to the top down stuff, right? It's like, yeah, it's probably not going to work if it's top down every single time.
I love that. Principles over dogma. I think we're getting close to that. Nice. Awesome. Well, thank you, Andrew. Really appreciate the time in doing this. It was super interesting. Thanks everybody for joining us. And Andrew, where can people find more of you? Beside the platform engineering Slack, obviously.
I mean, you can just ping me. I'm not a social media person. I mean, you can just like, that's my email. If anybody wants ever, I'm totally, I do a lot of coffee chats with people. I'm very passionate about the platform space and like just seeing it change, like technology in general. And like, so if I spend a lot of time like coaching and mentoring people, I'm always open for like a quick chat if somebody has questions about stuff. I spend probably a decent amount of time on that outside of Predvana. But I'm not a Twitter person and I'm not so like you're asking like where
email's good. Email's good. Kudos.
I like Slack is like this. I've been trying to like the Slack thing is new to me also, by the way. Look at like you guys are the first place I've actually, it's the only Slack channel I engage in. By the way, like I don't do anything else like outside of that one. But that's kind of that's the places. Feel free to drop me an email though.
Awesome.
Thank you. Awesome.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening or day. Bye-bye.